There are times in my life where I have spent a lot of time out in the wilderness by myself. It was something I enjoyed when I was younger, and that I can't do anymore now that I am much older. I do miss most of those days now, but there have been a few instances of things that weren't very pleasant. Now I imagine you can think that I have come across my share of scary wild animals or scorpions or things like that. However, that is not what my story is going to be about. This particular time I was on a very long hike through the mountains. That was my preferred method of adventure. I was trying to see as much as I could of the outdoors while I was able to, so I would rarely go to the same place twice. This time was my first time ever going through the Appalachian Mountains. The woods in those mountains could still be very thick depending on where you were. I brought a tent with me just in case there was severe weather that would warrant it, but for the most part, I just slept outside. Having done this many times before, I wasn't really scared of anything out there. I had even had some mild encounters with dangerous animals in the past too, but I never got injured. I showed the animals respect by keeping out of their way, and they did also kept out of my way, so there were never any problems. I hunted and fished for most of my food, so I didn't have food on me to attract animals, so I didn't worry about things like bears. There were supposedly a lot of black bears in the Appalachian Mountains, but during this trip and subsequent ones, I never came across one. I was heading south toward a specific area where I would rejoin civilization, and it was slow going. I stayed away from actual hiking trails to keep away from people too. One of the primary goals of these hiking trips of mine was to try and keep away from people as much as possible and just feel something in nature. When you spend so much time out in the woods, you begin to get habituated to the normal sounds out there. Once you do, you then become hyper-aware of anything that sounds like it is out of the ordinary. About a week and a half after I had disappeared into the mountains, I began getting a little nervous. I began hearing the occasional sound that seemed totally out of place for where I was. There were occasional things like the snapping of twigs that I hadn't been hearing before, but there was also the absence of noises at times as well. For example, I was hearing a lot less bird noises at certain times. I went to sleep one night and was woken up by something in the middle of the night. I didn't know what it was, but normally the noises of the forest didn't wake me up. I easily went back to sleep again. However, I was woken up by something a couple more times that night before I finally fell asleep and didn't wake up until morning. The following day was pretty similar to that day. There was just something that seemed a little off and was bothering me throughout the day. I couldn't quite put my finger on it, and it really was beginning to bug me. I hated the idea of my camping trip getting ruined, especially because whatever was happening was probably just in my head. I woke up the following morning after that, after having another night that had multiple interruptions. Fortunately, I was okay not getting a whole lot of sleep, so that didn't bother me too much. It was just the constant notion that something off that was really bugging me. That night it seemed like there might be a little rain, so I put my tent up for the night. I did end up raining a little bit, but not too much. I tend to sleep better when it rains outside, so I did sleep like a rock that night. The following morning, I felt a little stiff, so I stayed lying down for a little longer than I usually would. When I finally got out of my tent, I noticed something that scared the hell out of me. There was a really old doll hanging by its neck from one of the trees right outside of my tent. It was set up in a spot that I would have been sure to see at the moment that I stepped out of the tent, and I knew that it hadn't been there the night before. For the first time since everything had begun feeling off, I actually began feeling a little scared. I suspected that the reason I had been feeling off was because I was getting the feeling that I was being watched. Of course, now that feeling had been amplified. Someone had to have been watching me in order to have set that up. Plus, their message was pretty clear. I wasn't really sure what I could do about it, however. I had a general map of the area, and I decided to detour toward a road. It would take me a while to get there, but I figured it was the safest thing to do. Someone was obviously hostile and did not want me in that area. It took me about a day to make it to the road. All the time, I kept having that weird off feeling. All the time, I felt like someone was watching me. I didn't even feel comfortable when I did make it back to the road. I don't know if I kept going the way I had been going if I would have come across something I wasn't supposed to see. But there was some reason that someone really didn't want me in that area, and I got their message loud and clear. When I was growing up, we lived in a rural home that was probably an hour away from the elementary school that we attended. We would catch the bus to school every morning, but the bus did not come down the gravel road that we lived on. We would have to get up early in the morning when it was still dark outside, and after getting ready for school, we would have to walk along the road until we came to the paved road. That is where the bus would pick us up and take us to school. It was usually still dark out when the bus would pick us up, and we would watch the sun come up as the bus took us to school. There weren't a whole lot of houses along that walk either. There was only one small one that had another student living in it. This was my friend Jeff, who was my best friend throughout my school years. He would meet us when we walked by his house and walk with us all the way to the bus stop. There was an even older house, though, that we walked by, but it was abandoned. It was boarded up, and according to my parents, no one had lived in that house for a very long time. We were forbidden to go and explore it because our parents said that it was very old and could be dangerous. We used to go exploring in the woods around the house quite often, which is why I suppose they thought we might try exploring the house too. When I was 11 years old, I was walking to the bus stop with Jeff. As we were passing by the house, I noticed something really strange. It looked like there was light coming from the second story of the house. I could have sworn that I saw a figure in the second-story window, looking out through the curtain. The house was maybe 50 feet back from the road, so it was possible that I wasn't seeing it correctly. Jeff claimed that he didn't see anyone himself, but I was pretty sure of it. I don't know why it is, but the idea of someone living in an abandoned house was sort of frightening to me. I became nervous as I would walk by the house, but really only in the mornings when it was dark outside. In the afternoon, walking home, all of that fear would go away, and I never noticed anything. So I thought that perhaps in the morning my imagination might have been overactive, and I tried my best to leave it at that. That was until one day, when Jeff's cousin was riding the bus home with us and got off at our stop. He was going to be staying the weekend over at Jeff's house. Jeff had told his cousin, who I cannot recall the name of, that I had thought there was someone in the house. So his cousin thought we should check it out on the walk home. If any of us were scared to do this, and I know that I definitely was, no one said anything about it. The yard was very unkempt and the driveway was there, but it had been grown over a bit. But the three of us walked up into the house. We stopped not too far from the entrance to the house. It had 3 steps leading up to a very old porch. I kept looking up at the window, trying to see if I could see the figure that I had been seeing up in the window. But I didn't see anyone. Jeff and his cousin dared me to go up on the porch and knock on the door. There was nothing that I wanted to do less, but I couldn't wuss out in front of those guys. So I decided to just do it and get it over with. I did take my time walking up the steps to the house, but knew I shouldn't take too long. Finally, I knocked on the door really fast. I heard a noise that startled me, and I ran back to my friends who were laughing pretty hard. Jeff's cousin had thrown a rock at the house to scare me, and that was the noise that I had heard. I remember pretending to think it was funny, but it had scared the hell out of me. But when all 3 of us looking back at the house, for one moment, we caught someone looking out of the front window at us. We only saw them for a second before they moved quickly away from the window. We were only 11, so we were pretty freaked out and ran away from the house. We still had vivid imaginations at that age and thought that it might be a ghost or a crazy person living in the house. If that wasn't scary enough, later that evening Jeff came over to my house. I was surprised that he did because it was so late and was dark out, but we often hung out after dark. But what he told me surprised me. The old house was on fire. He wanted me to come and see it. Well, my whole family went actually, and he was right. The house was burning down on the exact day that we had seen someone in it. This, of course, made us begin to wonder if whoever was in the house had something to hide, and they burnt the house down once they had been discovered. I don't know. The whole thing might not have been really scary, but it definitely was very creepy. There wasn't a body or anything found in the house, so whoever it was must have burned it down and left. We never did find out who it was. When you are a kid, you can tend to believe in some pretty outlandish things. We lived in an old subdivision. Nowadays, the houses all tend to look alike. But if you go into an older neighborhood, they didn't make places like that then. I am sure that you have heard these types of stories before. Kids dare each other to go up on the porch and knock on the door on Halloween. Teenagers use them for drinking and things of that nature. But mostly they are houses that sit empty, and people simply generate stories about them. Anyway, we had one of those houses. However, I knew why the house was deserted. A husband had murdered his wife a decade before I was born. The house then just sat empty for the longest time. It also had for sale signs in front of it, but it was obviously never going to sell. The house wasn't known as a drinking spot, though. It was just simply seen as a murder house by those who knew its history. There is this urban legend I always liked. It was about a girl who was dared to sit on the grave of a murderer at night. She took a knife with her so that she could stab it into the ground to prove she was there. When her time was up, she stabbed the knife into the ground and tried to leave. However, something was holding her to the ground. She was found dead the following morning of a heart attack, and the knife was stabbed through her coat, anchoring her to the grave. So when I was 16, a couple friends of mine were hanging out and passing the guitar around and enjoying some smoke. That was when I got the idea to dare one of my friends, a blowhard named Jack, to spend an hour inside the murder house. We didn't do anything such as give him a knife, because we would all go to the house with him. We would know exactly what was going on. Jack took the dare pretty quickly. He wasn't scared of anything, and he was actually feeling pretty good thinking how he was the only one of us four who had the balls to actually try anything like that. We all went out to the murder house and broke into the backyard. Jack went searching around, trying to find a way to get in. We eventually were able to compromise a window, and Jack went in. He had to stay there for an hour and then come back out. The hour passed, but Jack didn't emerge from the house. We didn't worry about it, though, because he could have lost track of time. After another 30 minutes, we still were not worried about it. Our immediate thought is that by that point, Jack was trying to prove his manhood even more by staying in the house longer than we agreed. When 2 hours had passed, we came to a new conclusion. We thought that Jack was most likely in the house and deliberately taking more time than he was dared because he wanted to try to scare us in some way. I walked up to the window and called for Jack. He didn't answer. I called again and told him we knew what he was up to. He didn't answer again. I called him a few more times and still there was no answer. Finally, I decided to be the one to go into the house and look for Jack. I did this and climbed in the window. I kept calling for Jack as I walked around the house. I kept expecting him to jump out and try to scare me also. I was only on edge waiting for this to happen. I searched several rooms and found a door that was closed. Opening it up, it was a bathroom with a closed shower curtain. It was a typical horror movie setup, of course. Jack was either in the bathtub, waiting for me to open the curtain, or he was hiding outside the bathroom and would attack me from behind. I crept up upon the bathtub, grabbed the curtain and pulled it open. There was Jack, sitting in the bathtub, hugging his knees to his chest. He was rocking back and forth and appeared to be scared out of his mind. I tried to get him to talk to me, but he wouldn't speak at all. And he wasn't acting either. I mean, this dude was scared. Scared out of his wits. I had to go back and find my other friends and had to get them in the house. Together, we took Jack out of the house and brought him back to his home. Jack was terrified, and none of us knew why. He didn't speak a word to any of us for nearly a month. And when he did, it wasn't about the house. He acted like the whole thing never happened. We were worried about upsetting him, so we didn't bring it up. I'm sorry I have no resolution to this story and hope you'll forgive me for that. This was 14 years ago. I didn't keep in contact with Jack after college. I can tell you one thing, though. If he is out there and he hears this story, I would love for him to tell me what happened. When I was in my teens, I used to hang out with my cousin Kevin a lot. I lived in town and he lived out of town, in a more rural area. I liked that area very well because of exploring and things like that. Well, one summer he invited me and our mutual friend Jack over for a sleepover weekend. We rented some scary movies and were going to watch them on the VCR. Neither I nor Jack had a VCR, but Kevin's family did. So it was one of the reasons I liked going over there. I don't recall what movies we watched, but like normally we were making fun of each other for being scared. And as early teenage boys tend to do, we all denied that we were. So we came up with an idea. There was a covered bridge down the road from Kevin's house. It was well past midnight. We thought we would sneak out, head on over to the bridge, and dare each other to walk through it alone. When we got there, we realized that our mission was far creepier than we thought it would be. It was dark, and there was really no source of light at all. Although we could see a little bit, the inside of that bridge was completely dark, and it was really scary. We gave each other a hard time about crossing the bridge. I think that at this point, each of us hoped the other two would back out of the dare. That way, we could all skip it and save face. But unfortunately, Jack decided to do it. Kevin and I were on pins and needles as Jack slowly went walking into the bridge. In moments, he was completely out of our sight. Kevin and I waited and we waited, and it was quiet. We didn't see Jack, but we could hear creaking noises, so we knew he was walking. Suddenly, Jack began screaming for help. Kevin and I jumped out of our skin. I guess under the surface, we knew Jack was just trying to scare us. But it still scared us. And despite the fact that he was screaming for help, the two of us turned and booked down the road away from the bridge. We stopped then and waited for Jack to come back to us. We just knew he would have a huge grin on his face, knowing he had been the only one brave enough to go across the bridge, and also knowing he scared the two of us into running. But Jack didn't come. We waited and waited, and he didn't come. After a while, Kevin and I went back to the bridge. We had brought a small flashlight. We hadn't used it before because the dare wouldn't be scary if it had been lit. We shined the flashlight into the bridge. We saw what looked like Jack lying over halfway through the bridge. Upon getting closer to him, we noticed his clothes were ripped up and he was bleeding. He was also in a ball, crying his eyes out. There was no doubt about it then. Jack's screams were real. We helped him up and tried to get him to talk while we got him home. He was so distraught. He told us that something had grabbed his ankle while he was walking and tripped him. It then was hurting him as he lay on the ground screaming for help. He wasn't sure why it stopped, but it did, and was gone. He was too freaked to get up and leave until we had come there. We don't know who it was to this day. I think it was a who. Both Kevin and Jack still believe it was a cryptid or something. I don't buy that sort of thing myself. I think it was some crazy homeless person or drunk or something. Maybe some crazy person laying in wait for someone crossing the bridge. Who knew? Jack didn't know. It had been too dark to see anything. I didn't have a lot of friends growing up. There were times when I would have someone to hang out with for a short period of time. But those friendships rarely lasted very long. More often than not, I always ended up being alone. I didn't mind being alone, really. It was nice to have time to think, and I did that quite a lot. I used go on really long walks simply to have time to think. While I didn't have many long-term friends, I did know a couple of bullies, and the absolute worst bully I ever knew was this guy named Billy. He was one of those childhood and eventually teenage thugs that you knew was going to end up in prison someday. He was always getting into fights. He was always getting suspended from school, and before he was 16 years old, he was expelled from school. This story, however, takes place before then. I was 13 years old at the time, and I think Billy was 15, and it happened on Halloween night of that year. Now, I had trick-or-treated the year before. I probably would have done so at 13 if I had friends to go with me. But I was feeling a bit weird about the whole idea. Still, I loved the atmosphere of trick-or-treating. I liked seeing all of the people out there enjoying Halloween. So, although I didn't dress up and I didn't go house to house asking for candy, I actually did go out for a long walk in the neighborhood. In our neighborhood, tons and tons of children would be out trick-or-treating. People went all out in decorating their houses. Individual yards turned into haunted houses, and parents dressed up tried to scare trick-or-treaters as they came to their houses. This is why I was not able to just stay home in Halloween night. It was just way too fun. So I walked through the neighborhood back and forth a few times. Seeing everyone having so much fun did sort of get me down after a while. It made me feel that maybe it would have been okay one more time to go trick-or-treating. But of course by that point, it was too late for me to change my mind. As trick-or-treating wound down, I was feeling even more down than I had before. So I decided I would keep walking. I walked out of the neighborhood and even walked out of town. I hadn't brought a watch with me, so I was never sure exactly how long I had been out or what time it was. When you are depressed and walking around, you can lose track of time pretty quickly. At one point, I came across the cemetery that was out of town. Feeling that my Halloween had been a bit disappointing, I decided maybe a trip through the cemetery might cheer me up a bit. I could still end my Halloween with a bit of a spooky time. Have you ever been walking and you come along a stray dog or a stray cat? And a lot of times you do that and the animal follows you around? It's usually a really nice thing to happen. As I walked into the cemetery, a really big Rottweiler came trotting up toward me. At first I froze out of fear. I mean, those dogs are huge and I had no idea what to expect from it. I was pleasantly surprised, though, when the dog came up to me and nuzzled my hand. So I tried to be brave and pat the dog on the head. He was responsive, so I tried scratching his ears. He liked that too. So I decided that I had come across a friendly companion for my walk through the cemetery. I have to admit also that I was a bit happier to have the dog with me for my walk. Cemeteries are pretty scary no matter what. The dog trotted right beside me as I walked through the graveyard. Even with him there, I have to admit being a bit unnerved. But that's what I was looking for. It was quite in the cemetery, and the small breezes of wind making the trees rustle a bit was eerie. However, I was only slightly on nerve about being there. The dog stayed with me throughout the entire walk through the cemetery. But when I got to the other side, to the exit, he only followed me for a short period of time afterward. The dog sat down on the ground and looked at me. I stopped and gave his ears another scratch. I thanked him for coming along with me. He then turned and ran back toward the cemetery. I have to admit I was a little disappointed at losing my companion, but I was happy for the experience. I started thinking that he wasn't a stray. Maybe he was a guard dog that belonged to whoever was the caretaker for the cemetery. If so, he was the nicest guard dog I had ever come across. One of the things I didn't like about Halloween was that it often fell on a weekday. So I had school the next day. I had been out really late the previous night, so I was sort of sleepwalking through the day. During lunchtime, I was eating alone, and that was someone came and seated themselves across from me at the table. I was shocked to see that it was Billy. I was scared but also surprised. He wasn't the kind of guy to bully someone in the lunchroom, where he would be easily caught. "Enjoy your little walk through the graveyard?" he asked me. "You're so chicken shit that you had to take your dog with you? You can't have him with you all the time, you little fag." With that, Billy got up and left. I was stunned. It took me a little while to try and put two and two together. Once I did, I realized that he and his buddies must have been hanging out in the cemetery and saw me walking through the previous night. As his comments sunk in further, I realized that the only reason this sociopath hadn't attacked me was because of that huge Rottweiler that had followed me through the graveyard. I don't really know what to think about that. Did the graveyard have a guard dog? I had no way of knowing, and I was not going to go there or call there and ask. Was it a stray dog that just coincidentally came up upon me? I have no idea. But knowing how crazy and mean Billy was, if he had attacked me that night, who knows what would have happened to me? It wouldn't have been good.